One thing that I read, a different way to talk about it, is that emotional brokenness means spiritual brokenness, and that is not true. You can be connected to God, you can be going to church, praying, studying the Bible, and still have an emotional brokenness. And that doesn't mean you are broken as a person, but that's something that needs to be worked through, and that can be very conflicted about a Christian.
Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chikowski. I'm the worship director for Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church Richardson. And every week on this podcast, our lead pastor, Julie Richter, is with me. How's it going, Julie?
Hey, it's good. How are you, Eric?
I'm awesome, thanks.
Awesome. So I've been reading a really good book this week. You want to hear it?
I do.
So it's sort of weird. It's by Jenny Lawson, and it's called Furiously Happy, a funny book about horrible things. And it caught my attention because I was looking at a lot of different books around mental health and depression and sort of thinking that I needed to broaden my understanding around that topic for the sermon series that we're in. And it was such a funny book. I mean, it's exactly like the title says, a funny book about horrible things.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of conversation and books and movies out there, both fictional and non-fictional, that really talk about mental illness and personality and those sorts of things. And it's such an important topic for us to speak on in the church. And that's why in week 2 of our label series, we were really excited to dive into labels around intellect and mental illness and those sorts of things.
So we've got a great interview today with Dr. Jason Berman. Jason is a psychologist, but he is also one of the members of our Access congregation. So we're going to be talking to him today about mental illness and the stigmas around mental illness, as well as ways in which we can be helpful as a church and individually to lift people up and to move beyond these labels.
Well, we are here with Dr. Jason Berman. Jason is a licensed psychologist and has a vast amount of experience in the area of mental health, and we are really excited to speak with him today about the way that folks are labeled in some intellectual and mental ways. Jason, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Hey, do us a favor, give us a little bit of context. Tell us, in the field of psychology, what you do professionally and maybe what led you to this point in your career.
Oh, you bet. So, yeah, I'm a psychologist. I actually made it to Dallas to go to graduate school at UT Southwestern. And then since that time, I've been in practice, and I see people for anxiety, depression, trauma, that sort of thing. And what brings me to this point is more and more I'm learning about, being Christian and being a psychologist and how those overlap is a point of interest for me. So that's one of the reasons I'm glad that you all are having these discussions.
What are some of the ways that you've seen that overlap?
Well, one way is that I work with people who are Christian, and they come in and they say, oh, it's almost like they secretly come and see me. And right away, I know it's about stigma. Right? And we can talk more about stigma and what that is. But what I've seen is that people will have this inner sense of there's something broken inside me. And one thing that I read, a different way to talk about it, is that emotional brokenness means spiritual brokenness, and that is not true. You can be connected to God, you can be going to church, praying, studying the Bible, and still have an emotional brokenness. And that doesn't mean you are broken as a person, but that's something that needs to be worked through, and that can be very conflicted about a Christian. A Christian coming to therapy, for example.
Wow, that's really helpful. Okay, so there has been so much work done around psychology, around what happens in our brains and the connection between our head and our heart, personality tests and IQs and family systems theory. So talk to us just a little bit about how different personality tests, or even just understanding people in conversation as you hear their stories and their struggles, how that's helped you work through the labels that we put on people as far as psychology goes.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Julie. So one of the things I was thinking about is that labels can have a useful function. Mm-hmm. And so, when you talk about personality inventories, there's one that's called the MMPI that I use a lot. It's probably the most well-researched inventory, and it will categorize people based on research, based on gender, education, and what their answer profile is. And so what I'll do is I'll have them take it, I send it away and get a narrative, and it can give some basics for here's what might be going on with you compared to your peers. And so it's a really nice use of this is a category that you're fitting in, but we can try to understand that in how you particularly have those traits. So that's kind of a beginning of an answer of maybe the positive side of a mental health label.
Right, yeah. Because some of those mental health labels, I mean, we have to use, especially in your line of work, so bipolar and even narcissistic personality disorder. And those are the types of things I think that pop up on a test like the Is it
MMPI?
MMPI.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are so many other even personality assessments. I know the three of us in this room know the Enneagram a bit. There's Myers-Briggs and several others that can be a helpful tool I have found for knowing myself and knowing others.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the Enneagram. What I really like about it is that you start with broader categories like stances, right? So you might have an aggressive stance or withdrawing stance or a dependent stance. And so someone can sort of identify, oh, yeah, I am more like that. And then you winnow down to something more specific. And so that's what I would say is that labels are helpful to get the discussion started and to categorize and get us talking about it. But then we want to get down to the individual, and Enneagram can help do that as well.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about some of the positive effects of labels, but certainly we've all experienced negative labels. Why do we think that negative labels are so prevalent? Why do they exist? And why would we label people as crazy or stupid or psychotic?
Right. No, excellent question. And you guys probably have ideas about this too. And the first thing that comes to my mind is we want to put on someone else what we hope we don't have. So if I call someone psychotic, I would argue that unconsciously, I'm afraid that I'm going to be like that. But if you are like that and you're other, then I'm not. And so what's funny about things like psychotic is that has a real purpose in psychology. A psychotic break is a real thing that happens, but it gets hijacked into anything that you don't like or that you're uncomfortable with. And it can even be more nefarious in that people with maybe mental illness can be seen as dangerous, and so you put them down and say they are that and it's not me. And so that's a negative way of distancing or even shaming someone, with that.
We had Carl Smith on a few weeks ago, and Carl reminded us of the saying that many of us have probably heard, hurt people hurt people.
Yes.
And it seems in the way that you're describing it, if I'm projecting sometimes these labels, these negative labels on other people, it's out of a fear that I may actually be that myself. But if I can label you as that, then the optic is that I'm not crazy, I'm not psychotic because that person over there is.
Exactly. And one of the things I do is group therapy. And it's interesting, I like to work with Christians in a group therapy because in group you learn that it's easy to scapegoat. So we are all healthy and good and righteous, but you right there are bad or psychotic or whatnot. And what group therapy helps you do is see, no, actually there's a part of me in the thing that I attack in you. And the thing I would add to Carl's statement is hurt people hurt other people, but some of the hurt people hurt themselves, so they have a sense of basic shame, fall into themselves and be like, I'm really worthless, I'm this and that. And being shamed by labels can reinforce that.
Right, yeah. The narrative that's already going on in someone's head that is just in some ways validated to them when somebody else attacks them and villainizes them as a way to maybe even self-preservation.
Exactly.
Maybe another word I would use.
Yeah, we might
for it.
say self-stigma. So you could even see it happening in media, for example, and then feel it yourself. So there could be a whole campaign of don't do this anymore. But if the person has perceived or self-stigma, that's a problem that needs to be sort of worked out.
Well, and you mentioned the media. I was thinking just a second ago as we were talking about how we project that people with mental illness or who struggle with mental illness are dangerous or violent. And is it the movie Psycho where there's the stabbing?
In the shower.
Yes,
Yeah, in the
exactly.
shower.
Exactly.
And so,
That's all right.
and so no wonder, it's not like we pull that out of thin
Right.
air, you
No,
know?
it's true. There's been research that shows that people with mental illness in the movies are some of the scariest people.
Mm-hmm.
But what in reality research shows is that people with a mental illness, say schizophrenia,
Mm-hmm.
are more likely to be a victim of a crime than to commit one. That's a robust finding.
Wow.
Much more likely to be victimized.
So, talking about the stigma around mental health, very often we view them as dangerous or scary. What are some of the other stigmas around mental health?
Oh, one of them is, let's talk about depression and anxiety, okay, sort of within the church. If I open up about that, others might think, oh, it's too uncomfortable. I can't talk about that, and, I'm feeling really empty today. Oh, someone might recoil and say, what? Aren't you a Christian? Aren't you a believer? I mean, you can't possibly be empty. And so one of the stigmas is that talking to someone who has conflicted feelings, we might say, is too troubled. I wouldn't know what to say. And really, it's not about saying the right things. It's about being there, being with someone. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's so easily confused and uncomfortable for people that we don't, we talk about that a lot in the church. We don't like to be uncomfortable.
Right.
And yet Jesus was constantly in uncomfortable situations
such
and
a good
putting
point.
himself right in the middle of it. And I wonder sometimes if because we don't have the right answers or if because we don't have a fix, we feel helpless in the midst of that. And so we don't know how to just simply be present for someone. Yet the byproduct of that is that if they already feel alone, we're helping them to continue to feel alone by not being simply present with them.
I couldn't have said it better. Depression, anxiety, it increases in isolation. And so if someone out of a good motive says, well, I don't want to bother them or I want to give them their space, often leads to exactly what you're saying. And that's not a good thing.
Well, it's such a good reminder for all of us to remember that even if we don't know the right thing to say, even if we don't feel like we have walked the same struggle, taking the time to be willing to be with someone is the gift itself.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, Jason, can you tell us a story of a time when you saw labels put on someone's mental health, whether they were positive or negative, and how that affected that person and maybe even how it affected you?
Well, one that comes to mind in my work is there's a term borderline personality. And this is a very troubled condition. People have a lot of struggle, but we can easily call someone, she's borderline. And what that does for me as the therapist, it automatically brings in my biases. Oh, she's borderline. Oh, is she going to sue me when I try to do therapy, or is she going to attempt suicide? And that's not fair because that label can bring in the negative things that have happened, but it doesn't necessarily mean that person. And so I've literally worked with someone who's come in with a really negative label and they've not been so severe, whereas I was biased that way to begin with. And so it just hurt the process.
Yeah, back to that self-preservation.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that has to be difficult because you do have to protect yourself to a certain extent.
Exactly.
But yet the line of work and the things that you're doing call you to really be present in ways with people that, another job wouldn't. And
That's
so
right.
it makes you more vulnerable in some ways, but also more capable of helping people in those positions as well.
Both are true. Yeah. Thank you, Julie. That's exactly right. I go into the vulnerability, but I'm also somewhat vulnerable. And by the grace of God, I have not been attacked in a kind of emotional sense. I know of other therapists who have had more trouble that way. And so that is really a true thing. But in order to help someone, I have to be able to connect with them in a real way. So it's difficult, it's meaningful, and it has some risk, you might say. Yeah.
So you mentioned the intersection between the work that you do and your Christian faith. What are some things that you would love to see the church speak out on in regards to mental health?
When I first went to a Methodist church in Kansas, actually Adam Hamilton's place, one thing that really interested me is that they were talking about depression and anxiety. And so I like the Methodist approach to, hey, we can talk about that. And so I think Methodists are strong in that and can maybe teach others on how we can speak openly. The other piece is that church member to church member, we need to be able to talk freely. It's like, oh, you're depressed? Tell me about that. And it doesn't mean, you're bad in some way or you deserve to be shamed or whatnot. And so I think there's macro and micro, if you will. It's like person to person to try to be less judgmental about that, and then what happens at the leadership.
Well, and again, speaking of stigmas, as we did earlier, the stigma of having to put our best foot forward when you walk into church, feeling
exactly.
like you can't sort of let your baggage out.
Right, Sunday best.
Yeah,
Sunday
that's right.
best.
And
That's
so
right.
what a beautiful picture of the church, and quite frankly, the picture that Jesus painted for us in all of his ministry, to be able to be open about that, to own those sorts of things, to repent for the areas that we've strayed away from God, or in the instance of depression and mental health, just to be willing to own the struggle and call on our brothers and sisters to walk with us through those valleys. And we as the church need to be willing to step in and lift up our fellow Christians as they walk through those struggles.
You bet. You might say that in the church, we're on the front line because sort of anyone can come, right? And so it's going to bring, 20% of the population has some version of depression, and so it's going to be right there with the people we sit with in Sunday school, in group, in church, right?
Absolutely. Well, and Jason, you said earlier, the word that caught me was non-judgmental. And I think sometimes about how wrapped in shame both depression and anxiety already is. And so for the church to be a place that is casting any sort of judgment on that or any sort of stipulations around that, meaning in your spiritual life that if you just believed more, or if you just had more faith, or if you would just be more grateful, then you would be happier or more joyful. And so I really appreciated your distinction between the emotional life and the spiritual life, and that those who are going through some sort of emotional brokenness, that doesn't always indicate that there is a distancing or a brokenness in their faith as well.
That's correct. I agree. And it's good to check out, are things going well? Like, are you praying? Are you using those as resources? But it doesn't go the opposite direction. Because you're not, you're therefore emotionally broken. And that brokenness emotionally can also come from childhood, and it can surface in adulthood.
Right.
So Jason, for someone who is struggling, we talked about the importance of being present, and maybe that's one of the most important things we can do. Are there other things as individuals that we can say or do that are helpful in someone's life who's struggling with mental illness?
Yeah, you bet. I think to find resources, I'm a psychologist. I know a lot about resources. So people will call me, say I have, a daughter who's looking like she has bipolar, and it's be like, okay, call these people or do this or that. So it's to find resources. So that's one thing. And then also to be educated, to know ourselves. What is depression? One thing about depression that a lot of people don't know is that it's anger turned inward. So depression is kind of this term that we use, a label, but there's a lot more going on about I'm angry with myself for these things that have happened or that I wish would have happened or that sort of thing. So kind of education, resources, and then that support.
That's great. So Jason, we've got one more question for you that we ask every person that comes on the podcast. And it can be about this topic or it can be about anything that you would like. Up to this point in your life, what's one thing you wish someone would have told you?
That's excellent. One thing that I wish someone would have told me earlier is that having a non-dualistic approach to life really makes a huge difference. That if you compare yourself, they have it better, they have more ease, they're richer, they're smarter, what have you, it can cause a lot of problems. And it's taken me years to grasp that and to come to see that it doesn't make any sense to compare and say mine is better than yours or mine is worse than yours, which is what more Christians might tend to do, is mine's worse than yours. And so that kind of comes to mind.
Grass is always greener on the other
Yeah,
side.
well, and what a great way to think about that, even in terms of if we can shift from comparison to perspective, how more frequently gratitude would be present, how more willing to be in relationship with someone that is different than us, how, I think that perspective is very closely linked with compassion.
Exactly.
And I think we'd be a lot more compassionate if we stopped comparing ourselves and labeling people out of fear and
Out
self-preservation.
of fear to push them away or to judge them. And one thing you mentioned, compassion, and just thought of this, Julie, is I heard from you probably several years ago, love your neighbor as yourself. as you learn to love yourself. And you said that, and that's really stuck with me, and I've shared that with people and thought about it myself, that we need to have a more compassionate idea of who we are in knowing God's love. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Jason, it's a joy to have you in our Access congregation. We're constantly amazed with the diverse talents and experiences and areas of expertise of our congregation members, and you are no exception. We just really appreciate you diving into this topic with us today and sharing your thoughts and experiences. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and a joy for me too.
Thanks again. What great insight it is for us that sometimes the role of the church is to be present, to walk with people who are going through struggle or difficulty with depression or with their own mental health. We all as people have different emotional struggles that we go through, and I think sometimes we forget that one of the greatest human needs that we have is to be known. And it's so easy as we spiral into despair and depression to live in the fear of there's nobody out there who knows me. There's nobody out there who knows my struggle. There's nobody who could possibly know what I'm going through or care to walk through it with me.
But the good news that we find both in our scriptures and in our walk of faith and even in our journey in the church is that we are known. We are known first by a God who loves us, and we can connect in a place called the church with people who will not only know us but love us fully if we open that door. I want to leave you today with Psalm 139 that talks about a God who knows us fully. It says, "You have searched me, O Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light will become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made."
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or YouTube so you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Dr. Jason Berman for joining us this week, and make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with Micah Peacock about economic labels. Have a great week.